When Sarah first felt ill at her in-laws' dinner, she didn't think much of it. It was just a little sick. Maybe she was tired or ate something wrong. But when it started happening every time she sat down at the table, a feeling of unease began to creep into her thoughts. They were always so welcoming, smiling, warm, but something was wrong. With every dinner, Sarah felt fear creeping into her heart, dizziness, nausea, heaviness in her body, and then a sharp pain, as if someone was trying to break out from inside. What was it? She couldn't understand. Everything looked too perfect, too friendly. One day she decided she'd brought her dish to dinner, and then everything fell into place. The secret hidden behind smiles and warm words was revealed. If you are watching this video, please write in the comments where you are from. We are always happy to see where our viewers come from. You are incredibly important to us, and your comments help promote our channel, making it better every day. Sarah brought her dish to yet another family dinner, a seemingly unremarkable vegetable stew. She felt awkward. She didn't want to offend her mother-in-law, who always proudly set the table, emphasizing family recipes passed down from generation to generation. But Sarah could no longer ignore the strange symptoms that arose each time after these dinners. Something was wrong, and she needed to figure out what it was. When everyone sat down at the table, the atmosphere was warm as usual. Everyone was laughing, discussing the news. The children were playing in the living room, but Sarah couldn't shake the feeling that someone was watching her. For a moment, she even thought her mother-in-law's gaze hardened when she noticed her own dish on the plate. It was a moment that made her heart beat faster. However, no one said anything. When the food was in her mouth, she felt nothing, no pain, no discomfort, just normal food. She looked at the others at the table, watching them continue to eat the food her mother-in-law had prepared. Everything was as usual, but now Sarah saw it differently. A dark picture slowly began to form in her mind. After dinner, when everyone had left, she decided to stay and help in the kitchen. Her mother-in-law was silent, washing the dishes, but Sarah couldn't resist and asked a question. "Why do I always feel bad after your dinners?" Her voice was firm, but with a hint of tension. The mother-in-law froze at first, then continued washing the dishes, as if she had not heard the question. "I don't know what you're talking about," she replied coldly, not looking at Sarah. But Sarah saw her hands shaking slightly. It was enough to turn her suspicions into certainty. "Every time I eat your food, I feel pain, nausea. I decided to bring my own dish, and this time nothing happened. Something is wrong, and I think you know it." The mother-in-law slowly wiped her hands and turned around. Now her face was hard. Her eyes were burning with some strange coldness. "Maybe it's just your digestive system, Sarah. People with your heredity sometimes have a hard time adapting to new foods." The words cut through Sarah like a knife. She understood what her mother-in-law was talking about. It wasn't just about food. It was about something much deeper. Something that was never discussed openly, but was always in the air, racial hatred hidden behind polite smiles. "My heredity?" Sarah felt her voice waver, but she tried to keep it together. "What are you talking about?" The mother-in-law looked at her for a long moment, then shrugged and said, "You wouldn't understand, Sarah. There are some things that just don't go together. Maybe you should stick to your ways if you feel so uneasy." The subtle reference to her race was like a punch in the face. Sarah felt a wave of anger, mixed with pain, rise up inside her. She remembered all the little comments, the strange looks, the subtle hints from all the years she had been part of this family. All this time she had tried to ignore them, pretend that she didn't care, that they were just the nuances of family dynamics. But now it was clear, this was no accident. They had never truly accepted her. Everything suddenly fell into place. Her frequent illnesses, their strange comments, even the cold reception at the wedding when she first met her husband's family. They didn't want her there. She was an outsider, and that feeling was no longer just a hunch. "So you did it on purpose?" Sarah said the words with difficulty, feeling indignation boiling inside her. "Did you put something in my food to make me feel sick?" "Sarah." Her mother-in-law raised her hands as if to defend herself from her accusations, but there was no remorse in her voice. "You don't understand it that way. It's not what you think." "I don't get it." Sarah's voice broke and she felt her eyes fill with tears. "Is it all because I'm not like you?" The mother-in-law fell silent, her face becoming stern, like a mask. In the silence of the kitchen, these words hung between them like a heavy veil. "We just didn't think you were right for our family," the mother-in-law finally said. "You never fit in. We tried, but you're just different, Sarah, and you always will be." Sarah stood there, unable to believe what she was hearing. She felt like her whole world was crumbling around her. Her whole life with her husband, her attempts to be part of his family, had suddenly become a farce, a game in which she was always the loser. She turned slowly and walked towards the door. Her heart was beating wildly, tears were blurring her vision, but she knew one thing: she would never come back here again. These people were never her family. Sarah stormed out of the kitchen, her footsteps echoing in the empty hallway. Her heart pounded in her chest, as if it were bursting with pain and anger at the same time. She couldn't believe what she'd just heard. This wasn't a dream, not a terrible nightmare, it was real. Her mother-in-law, with whom she'd spent so many years trying to mend her relationship, didn't just despise her, she deliberately poisoned her at every dinner party. Halfway out the door, Sarah suddenly stopped. She couldn't leave like that. Her husband, Josh, was sitting in the living room, talking to his father, unaware of what was happening in the other part of the house. How could he not know? At that moment, a terrible thought flashed through her mind. Maybe he had always known? Clenching her fists, she turned and headed into the living room. Josh was sitting on the couch, relaxed, laughing at some joke his father was telling. As Sarah walked into the room, he turned around, his smile slowly fading as he saw the look on her face. "Sarah, what happened?" Josh stood up, his eyes filled with worry. He walked toward her, but she stepped back, raising her hand as if to push him away. "Did you know, Josh?" Her voice was quiet, but there was a steely hardness to it. "What are you talking about?" Josh frowned, clearly confused. "Did you know your mother poisons me at every dinner?" Sarah practically spat the words out, feeling her anger becoming uncontrollable. Josh froze, his face pale. His father, sitting on the couch, looked up sharply but said nothing. The room was silent, too loud, too oppressive. "Sarah, you must have misunderstood something." Josh finally spoke, trying to take her hand, but she pulled away again. "What are you talking about? Don't you understand?" Her voice was shaking with tears. "Every time I'm here, I get sick after eating her food. Today I brought my own dish, and for the first time in a long time I didn't feel terrible. She added something to the food. You can't not know that." "Sarah, this is crazy." Josh rubbed his face as if trying to cope with the emotions that had washed over him. "My mother would never do something like this." At that moment, the mother-in-law appeared in the living room door. Her face was calm, even icy, as if the conversation that had taken place was nothing special. "Sarah, stop," she said quietly but firmly. "You're emotional right now. Josh isn't to blame, and like I said, I've never done anything to hurt you." Sarah turned sharply to face her, her eyes blazing with anger. "Guilty? Do you really think I haven't noticed your subtle hints all these years? You're carrying comments about how I'm different from all of you, but these aren't just comments. This is bullying. I almost lost my health because of your hatred." Josh looked at his mother, then at Sarah, the confusion on his face becoming more and more noticeable. He couldn't figure out what was true and what was a lie. "Mom," he finally spoke, his voice hoarse. "Is this true?" The mother-in-law looked at him coldly, then at Sarah, her face stony. "You don't understand, Josh," she said, her voice quiet, but each word cutting through the air like a knife. "This family is our lineage, our tradition. We're not like her. We'll never be the same blood as her. I was just doing what had to be done to protect us." The words hit Josh like a bolt from the blue. He recoiled as if he had been physically struck and looked at his mother with horror in his eyes. "Mom, you, his voice trembled, like a man who suddenly realized that everything he knew was a lie. "Did you really do that?" Sarah stood there, unable to believe that the words had finally come out. All this time, she had hoped that Josh would be on her side, that he would stand up for her, protect her, but now she saw that he was as blind as everyone else. "Josh," her voice shook as she tried to take one last step toward him. "I can't be here anymore. I can't live among people who hate me." He stood motionless, stunned, trying to comprehend everything that had happened in the last few minutes. "Sarah, he began, but then stopped. He didn't know what to say. He didn't know how to justify what had happened, or justify his mother. Sarah looked at him one last time, and then headed for the exit. Tears were streaming down her cheeks, but she couldn't stay in this house any longer. She couldn't live in a world that wouldn't accept her for who she was. "You lost me, Josh," she said in parting, her voice quiet but full of final determination. Josh made no move to stop her. Sarah was torn apart by the feeling of betrayal and pain, but she knew one thing: now she was free from this nightmare, no matter how painful the decision was. The door slammed behind her, leaving Josh standing in silence, surrounded by shattered truth and the remains of his family. Sarah ran outside, barely holding back her tears. Everything inside her was screaming, a mixture of anger, pain, and betrayal tearing at her soul. The air was cold and burning, as if nature itself was responding to her inner chaos. She stopped by the car, breathing in sharply, trying to compose herself. For the first time in a long time, she felt like her world was finally falling apart. But this wasn't an ending, it was a release. But in that moment of victory, she felt something else, a deep, piercing sadness. The life she had built with Josh had just been destroyed. She didn't know what to do next. Everything she had strived for, family, love, acceptance, had been an illusion. Suddenly, there was the sound of footsteps behind her. Sarah turned to see Josh running after her, his face pale and distraught. He stopped a few meters away from her, as if hesitant to come closer. "Sarah, wait!" he shouted, his voice full of despair. "We can't end this way." She turned around, clutching the car keys, her heart pounding in her ears. Her gaze was full of pain, but no longer as soft and loving as before. "What kind of ending is this, Josh?" she said quietly, her voice barely trembling. "It's all over. I can't be here anymore. I can't fight for a place in a world that will never accept me." He stepped closer, his hands shaking as if he had just realized the full extent of his mistakes. "You know I'm not like them. I never wanted it to be like this. I didn't know. I didn't know about my mother. I swear." "You didn't know?" Sarah smiled bitterly, her eyes blazing with anger and disappointment. "What did you know, Josh? Did you ever see me suffer after your dinner parties? See how I got worse with each one? Or did you just turn a blind eye to it because it was easier for you?" Josh went pale, as if every word she said hit him with unbearable force. He couldn't find an excuse, because there was none. "Sarah, I was blind. I really didn't know my mother could be so cruel." His voice was full of bitterness. "But I love you. I don't want to lose you. We can fix this. I promise." Sarah stood motionless, her gaze cold. "Love?" she whispered. "Is that all you have to offer, Josh? Your mother tried to destroy me, and you never did anything to stop it." Josh looked desperately into her face, trying to find even one spark that could bring her back. "Please, don't leave me. We can leave here. Start over, away from my family. I'll do anything for us." Something deep inside Sarah changed in that moment. She looked at him, saw the pain and remorse in his eyes, but it couldn't change anything. She knew that this betrayal, not just of his mother, but his inaction, his blindness, was too heavy a burden to bear. She couldn't go back. Sarah turned to the car, about to drive away, but suddenly she heard something that made her freeze. A dull, heavy sound came from around the corner of the house, like someone had tripped and fallen. Sarah felt an inexplicable chill, something that kept her from simply driving away. She met Josh's gaze, and he read her confusion and ran back toward the house. A moment later, Sarah followed him. When she reached the porch, Josh was already standing there, frozen like a statue, staring at the figure lying on the ground. It was his mother. The mother-in-law lay on the cold concrete, her face pale and her eyes wide open. Her chest barely rose. A pillbox lay next to her. Some pills had fallen out of it. "Mom!" Josh screamed, rushing towards her. He fell to his knees, grabbing her by the shoulders. "Mom, what's wrong?" Sarah froze, her heart beating faster than ever. This wasn't just a fluke. Something was wrong with this moment. She suddenly realized that this whole tense atmosphere could be connected to something much darker than she thought. "Call an ambulance," Josh shouted, his voice shaking with panic. Sarah, like a machine, took out her phone and called an ambulance. At this time, Josh tried to bring his mother back to consciousness, but her condition was getting worse. When the ambulance finally arrived, the medics lifted her onto a stretcher. One of the doctors leaned over to Josh and said something quietly to him, which made his face turn even paler. Sarah stood aside, feeling that everything around her was spinning into some kind of vortex of strange events. She did not know what to do. At that moment, she only understood that this situation was much deeper than it seemed. Hours passed and the hospital was filled with an uneasy silence. Josh sat in the waiting room, his face covered by his hands. Sarah approached him, unsure how to start a conversation. He looked like he had lost his entire world. "What happened?" she asked quietly, sitting down next to him. Josh slowly raised his head, his eyes red from crying. "It wasn't just an illness," he whispered. "Mom was depressed for a long time. She hid it from everyone. I didn't know anything. The doctor said she took too many antidepressants." Sarah felt her chest tighten again. Her mother-in-law, the one she had considered her enemy, might herself be a victim of inner demons. It was unexpected. The whole picture suddenly turned upside down. "Josh," Sarah trailed off, not knowing what to say. "She could never get over the fact that I married you," Josh continued, his voice breaking, "but I didn't realize it was eating her up inside. She didn't just hate you, she hated herself for not letting go of her prejudices. In the end, it was killing her, and it seemed like she couldn't fight it anymore." Sarah felt something cold run down her spine. This wasn't just racism. This was a tragedy she could never have foreseen. Her mother-in-law didn't just hate her, she hated the part of herself that couldn't accept another person, broken by her own prejudices and fears. That night, as Sarah stood at the hospital window, she realized that not everything was as black and white as it seemed. Sometimes pain and hatred go hand in hand with inner demons that destroy not only those who hate, but also those who try to fight it. But that didn't change her mind. Her life with Josh was over. She couldn't go back to her old life, where she would be constantly reminded of tragedy and pain. Too much had been destroyed, but she didn't leave with hatred in her heart. She left with the knowledge that even the worst people can be broken by something bigger than we can see. She left Josh in the hospital that night, knowing that for him, this moment would be the beginning of his own journey to understanding. But for her, it was the end of one chapter and the beginning of a new one. A few days had passed since that terrible night in the hospital. Sarah had returned to her small apartment, leaving Josh and his family behind. But the events of the past weeks were still spinning in her head. She was trying to process everything that had happened, from her mother-in-law's crude racism to her despair, hidden depression, and suicide attempt. It seemed like reality had become too confusing. One morning, Sarah sat in the kitchen with a cold cup of coffee, looking out the window. Everything was quiet, but inside her, a storm of emotions was raging. She tried to block out the past, but the memories kept coming back. Every time she tried to relax, the image of her mother-in-law on the ground, Josh in despair next to her, came back to her. She had always known that racism was more than just prejudice or hostile attitudes. It was a wound that ran deep in people who might not even understand where their hatred came from. But this story was even more complicated. Sarah tried to remember all the times her mother-in-law had made unpleasant comments to her, when she had felt unwelcome in their home. Her racism had always been hidden behind a mask of concern, behind phrases that might have seemed harmless to outside observers, but hurt her to the core. "Why don't you cook the same dishes as my mother?" asked the mother-in-law. "Your culture is so exotic, but in our house we do things differently," she said with a smile. In that moment, Sarah realized that this wasn't just racism, it was a subtle, unnoticeable aggression that many people might not notice. But for her, a woman who had experienced it every time, it was excruciating. She remembered her mother-in-law once casually saying that she had always been against mixed marriages. It hadn't sounded like an insult, but like a statement that it was a universally accepted truth. Sarah had remained silent then, but now she couldn't let it go unanswered. An unexpected knock on the door brought her out of her thoughts. Sarah jumped and walked to the door. When she opened it, Josh was standing there. His face was haggard, his eyes full of worry, as if he hadn't slept for days. He stood there, unsure of how to start a conversation. "Sarah," he said quietly. She was silent, her eyes boring into him. He had changed in these few days, becoming pale, emaciated, but that no longer mattered to her. "What do you want, Josh?" she asked coldly, still holding the door ajar. He sighed, leaning heavily against the door frame. "I didn't know where else to go. After what happened," his voice shook, and Sarah felt that his words were filled with genuine despair. "I think about it all the time, about how I failed you, and myself." She closed her eyes tiredly, feeling how old wounds began to hurt again. "Josh, this doesn't change what happened," she said quietly. "Your mother tried to poison me. How could you not notice?" He shook his head as if he couldn't believe himself. "I was too blind, too stupid. I tried not to see it all the time. I thought it was just cultural differences, something I could ignore. But now I see how much deeper it goes, how her hatred destroyed not just you, but our entire family." Sarah looked at him, her gaze softened, but the pain in her heart remained. "She was destroying me, Josh. You should have seen it. Every comment, every look, but you didn't want to interfere because it was awkward. You knew she wouldn't accept me, and yet you did nothing." "I tried," he said quietly, lowering his head. "I tried to protect you. But I didn't realize how much you were suffering. I thought that if we just moved on, it would somehow change, that she would come to terms with it. But it didn't work out that way. You were too naive, Josh." Sarah sighed, clenching her hands into fists. "You couldn't just turn a blind eye to what she did. It's not just hostility, it's systemic hatred. You thought you could live between the two worlds without having to deal with it. But reality doesn't work that way." He stood as if he had been struck. "I know," he said finally. "I know I wasn't there for you the way I should have been. I can't fix it, but Sarah, I need to understand. I need to understand how I could have been so blind, how I could have let all this happen." Sarah was silent for a long time, studying his face. She saw the pain and remorse in his eyes, but she understood that this remorse came too late. "Josh," she said quietly, "this isn't just about your mother. It's about the entire system you grew up in. You lived in a world where your family thought they were better because they were white, where anything different was seen as a threat or a flaw, and you were a part of that, even if you didn't realize it." Josh covered his face with his hands, his breathing becoming ragged. "I don't know how to live with this," he whispered. "You have to accept it," Sarah said calmly. "You have to admit that part of you has always agreed with their prejudices, and that won't change until you're willing to do the real fighting. Until you admit that racism isn't just hatred, it's a system that perpetuates that hatred every day." He looked up at her with eyes full of tears. "And how can I change this?" he asked, his voice trembling. Sarah took a deep breath. "Start with yourself," she said firmly. "Start by realizing what you can do in your world. Stop being a bystander. You've lived for too long pretending nothing is happening. But now, if you really want to change something, you have to be willing to fight, and not just for yourself, but for others, too." Josh nodded slowly, his face softening, but he still looked lost. "What about us?" he asked quietly. Sarah sighed, her heart heavy. "I can't go back, Josh," she said, feeling every word cut into her. "Too much has been broken. I still love you, but it's not enough to continue living in a world where I'm not accepted. I can't be a part of your family again, knowing that they'll always hate me." Josh clenched his fists, holding back tears. "Please, Sarah, I can leave them. We can start over, without them, just you and me." Sarah shook her head. "It's not that easy, Josh. You can't just run away from it. You have to live through it, acknowledge it, and start working on yourself. And only then, maybe, will something change. But I can't be there to help you anymore. This is your path." He looked at her as if hoping she would change her mind, but her gaze was firm and determined. She could no longer continue on this path with him. "Goodbye, Josh," Sarah said quietly and closed the door. He stood in the hallway, realizing he had lost her because of his blindness, his fear of the truth, of the racism that was in his family, in his life, and maybe even in himself. Josh stood before the closed door, his breath ragged, his chest empty. He had lost her. He knew it, but he couldn't accept it. It was like a punch to the gut, a pain he couldn't recover from. He knocked on the door again, quietly, as if afraid of his own despair, but Sarah didn't open. "Sarah, please," he whispered, leaning his forehead against the door, his voice weak and trembling. "I can't lose you." There was silence. There was no room for him in her world beyond the door. Josh backed away slowly, realizing it was over. His legs were shaking, but he forced himself to turn and walk away. The silence was deafening. He felt like Sarah had taken everything with her, meaning, love, his future. Now he was alone with his mistakes and his ruined life. The dreary afternoon had turned to evening when Josh stepped outside. The city was gray, the air damp and sticky. He walked down the street, not really aware of where he was going. His mind was filled with memories of every little thing that had led them to this point, the collapse of their marriage, their life. Every moment he could have done something differently, but didn't. Every time he could have stood up for Sarah, but didn't. He had always loved her, but he had been too blind, too weak to see that love was more than just words. It required action. It required struggle. It required sacrifice. And now he understood it. Too late. Josh stopped as he passed the bar. He wanted a drink, to forget for a while. He took a step toward the door, but stopped. No, it wouldn't solve anything. Alcohol wouldn't bring Sarah back. He turned away from the bar and walked on, trying to somehow ease the emptiness that was creeping inside him. His phone rang. He glanced at the screen and saw his father's name. His stomach clenched. He knew he didn't want to talk to him, but he couldn't ignore the call. Something told him it was important. He answered. "Josh." His father's voice was as serious as ever. "Your mother, she's in the hospital." Josh stopped as if he had been hit in the head. "What happened?" He breathed out. "We thought she was getting better." My father's voice was quiet, almost inaudible, but the doctors said she had developed a complication. Her condition worsened. Josh gritted his teeth. He wanted to scream, to hit something, but instead he just stayed silent. His mother, the woman who had destroyed his marriage, the woman he had long idolized, was now on the brink of life and death. "I'll come," he finally said. The hospital was quiet and sterile, as always. Josh walked through the halls, feeling a wave of conflicting emotions rise up inside him. On the one hand, it was his mother, whom he loved despite everything that had happened. On the other, it was she, her racism and hatred, that had caused his life to fall apart. He walked into the room and saw his father sitting next to his mother's bed. She was pale, weak, with her eyes closed, barely breathing. His father's face was a mask of grief and helplessness. This was a man who had been used to being in control all his life, but now he could do nothing. "How is she?" Josh asked quietly, coming closer. "The doctors say it's just a matter of time," his father replied dully, not taking his eyes off his wife. "She's taken too many medications. Her body can't cope." Josh felt a cold sweat run down his back. He sat down in the chair opposite the bed, silently watching his mother. Her face, always hard and unyielding, was now lifeless, weakened. Suddenly her eyes slowly opened and she looked at Josh. There was no malice or hatred in her gaze, only pain and fatigue. "Josh," she whispered, her voice barely audible. He leaned closer, not knowing what to say. "Mom, I'm here," he said, trying to keep the trembling from his voice. She looked at him sadly, her lips trembling slightly. She coughed, her breathing becoming even more ragged. "I was trying to protect you." Josh frowned, not understanding. "Protect me?" he asked again. "Mom, from what?" Her eyes lit up and she tried to take a deep breath. "I didn't want you to suffer," she whispered, her voice barely audible. "I thought that if you married her, your life would become more difficult. People, they wouldn't accept you." Josh felt his heart begin to pound. All these years, he had thought that her hatred for Sarah was personal. He believed that she simply couldn't accept their marriage because of racism. But now, hearing her weak, trembling voice, he began to realize that it was much more complicated than that. "Mom, you ruined our lives," he said, his voice breaking. "You poisoned it. You tried to destroy it." Her eyes closed for a moment and a tear rolled down her cheek. "I thought I was protecting you," she repeated, her voice barely audible. "I was wrong. I only made things worse." Josh didn't know what to say. He looked at his mother, realizing that her prejudices and fears were deeper than he could have imagined. She truly believed that she was protecting him, that the world would not accept their family if it included a woman of another race. "I love you, Josh," she whispered, her voice growing weaker with each word. "I'm sorry." Her hand trembled, and Josh instinctively took it in his own. He felt her life slipping away. Every word she said was her last. "I forgive you, Mom," he said quietly, feeling tears welling up in his eyes. "But it's not enough." Her eyes closed and her breathing became even quieter. She could no longer say anything. Hours passed, and when the doctors entered the room, they quietly told Josh and his father that his mother was gone. It all seemed unreal. She was alive, breathing, and then she was gone. Emptiness filled the room, and Josh realized he was alone. Without his mother, without Sarah. He sat next to her bed, unable to move. His father stood up and walked out of the room without a word, leaving Josh alone. The silence was deafening. Josh sat there, realizing that his life had fallen apart. His mother, whom he had always thought of as strong, unwavering, was broken by her fears and prejudices. She could not cope with a world that was changing rapidly, and her hatred became her own punishment. Josh felt guilty, empty. He couldn't forgive her completely. Yes, she had loved him, but her love had been twisted, poisoned by fear of a world where her son could be happy with a woman of another race. And now she was gone, and he would never know if she could have changed, if she could have accepted Sarah, if she had had more time. He left the hospital lost in his thoughts. Life went on, people went about their business, but for Josh, the world stopped. He had lost everything he had ever had. Weeks passed. Josh tried to move on, but every morning he was greeted by silence and loneliness. Sarah had not returned. He wrote to her, called her, but there was no answer. She had chosen another life, a life without him, and that was her right. He could not blame her. Josh tried to return to normal life, but his world was no longer the same. The loss of his mother had left a deep wound, and Sarah's absence was acute, as if he had lost a part of himself. He went to work, did his duties, but every day was as if he stood on the edge of a precipice, ready to fall into the abyss. Several months passed, but thoughts of Sarah did not leave him. Every evening he looked out the window of his apartment, wishing for her to come back. He was tormented by feelings of guilt for not protecting her, for not fighting against the prejudice of his family. One evening, when he returned home after a long day at work, he noticed a familiar figure standing at his door. Josh's heart began to beat faster. It was Sarah. She looked a little different, but at the same time, she was still the same woman he loved. She stood with a basket of fresh produce, a bouquet of flowers in her hands. "Josh," she said as he opened the door, her voice quiet but hopeful. "Sarah," he breathed out, not believing his eyes. She came closer and he noticed that tears were shining in her eyes. "I missed you," she said, her voice shaking. Josh opened the door wider, letting her in. He felt a ray of light penetrate his heart, but at the same time, fear took hold of him. "I missed you too," he said, but he didn't know what else to say. They stood there, looking at each other, as if searching for the words that could change everything. Sarah slowly looked around the apartment, which seemed so empty and lifeless without her. "I brought you something," she said, holding out the basket. "I learned how to cook your favorite dishes." Josh took the basket, his heart aching with nostalgia. It was filled with all the things he loved: Mexican tacos, fried cactus fruit, and the hot sauce she always made with love. "Sarah, this is..." He didn't know what to say. "I came to talk. I understand that you've been through a lot, but I need to know if you can forgive me for leaving and for everything that happened." He sighed heavily and they sat down on the couch. There was an unresolved tension in the air and he didn't know how to start the conversation. "I thought you weren't coming back," he said, struggling to find the words. I don't know if I can forgive everything that happened, especially with your mother-in-law. I was confused too, she admitted, her voice softening. I didn't want you to suffer because of me, and when your mother... I just couldn't handle it. It was too much. Josh nodded. The memories of that night came flooding back, remembering how he and Sarah had faced prejudice together, and it had been terrifying, but now that they were together again, he wanted to figure out how to move forward. We can work on this, he said, feeling his heart fill with hope. I don't want to lose you again. Me too, she replied, her eyes shining, but I know it won't be easy. We'll need to talk about what happened and how we feel. I'm ready, Josh said. I need to figure out how we can get through this. I want to fight for you, for us. Sarah nodded, her face turning serious. I want you to know that I've experienced racism not only in your family, but in my life in general. It's like a permanent scar that never heals. Every time I tried to be myself, every time I was proud of my culture, someone told me I wasn't good enough. Her words penetrated Josh's very heart, and he felt a wave of anger and confusion wash over him. It's so terrible, he said, looking into her eyes. I can't believe people can be so cruel. And it's not just words, she continued. It's actions, it's discrimination. It's when you walk into a store and you feel like you're being looked at with bias. It's when you try to rent an apartment and you're turned down just because you're black. It's the constant feeling that you have to be better to be accepted. Josh listened, his eyes never leaving hers. He knew his experience was nothing compared to hers. He had always been in a privileged position, and now he knew what had to be done. I want to understand, he said, determined. I want to know what you've been through so I can support you, so we can change it together. Sarah smiled, and her eyes gleamed again. It wasn't just relief, it was hope. Thank you, Josh. This means more to me than you can imagine, she said. We can start by talking about how I've been able to cope, and I want you to know that you can take steps, too. I can't change the world alone, and I need you to be a part of it. Josh nodded, his heart filling with determination. They began to talk about what they had experienced, how it had affected them, and how they could work together to overcome the bias, the racism that still threatened their relationship. We can create our own world where we're not afraid to be ourselves, Sarah said. I want you to know that I'm proud of who I am, and that shouldn't change just because someone else thinks differently. Josh smiled, feeling a surge of pride at her strength. I'm proud of you, too. I'll stand with you to fight for this, he said. We can be a voice that changes society, that helps others who face the same hatred. Sarah looked at him, a spark of hope in her eyes. They continued talking, sharing their dreams, thinking about how they could change their lives and the lives of those around them. In the weeks that followed, they continued to discuss racism, bias, and their feelings. They decided to volunteer together at a local organization that fought racial discrimination. It wasn't just an action, it was a step toward awareness and understanding. One evening, they attended a meeting where a local activist was speaking. He spoke about the need for a unified effort, the importance of working together to make a difference. Josh listened with his mouth open, his heart filling with anger and determination. We must act, the activist said, addressing the crowd. Each of us can do something to fight racism in our society. It starts with us, with our environment. Don't be silent when you see injustice. Fight for those who cannot fight for themselves. Josh turned to Sarah and she nodded, her eyes shining. He felt the urge to act rise up in him. We can do this, he said, squeezing her hand tightly. We can speak out. We can unite with others. We are not alone in this fight. Sarah smiled, her smile full of hope. They began to connect with other participants, talking about their experiences, sharing their stories, and listening to the stories of others. These weren't just race issues, they were stories of struggle, of hatred, of how the world can be a cruel place, but also of how people can come together to help each other. A few months passed, and Josh and Sarah began organizing events in their neighborhood. They held open mic nights, where people of all ages and ethnicities came to share their stories. These gatherings became a place where everyone could be heard. They began to support each other, sharing experiences and joy. One day, after an event, a middle-aged woman approached Josh. She was black, and there was a trace of fatigue on her face. but also a spark of hope. "I heard your story," she said. "Thank you for doing this. I want you to know that your voice matters. We all need support." Josh felt his heart swell with pride. This was exactly what they wanted to do, create a space for others to feel safe. "Thank you," he replied, squeezing her hand. "We are all together, and we will continue to fight." As time passed, Josh and Sarah began to realize that their fight was not just a personal matter, but a social one. They began to join forces with other organizations that fought for the rights of Black people and against racism. They organized rallies, discussions, and lectures, attracting more and more people. One day, when they were preparing another event, an older white man, who was a representative of one of the organizations, approached them. "I'd like to talk to you about collaboration," he said, his voice confident. "I see what you're doing, and it's important. We need to come together to create change, not just for Black people, but for all of us." Sarah and Josh looked at each other, surprised and happy at the same time. "We're ready," Sarah said. "We need everyone to be involved in this fight. It's everyone's business." They began collaborating, organizing joint events that brought together people of different ages and ethnicities. These were dialogues, discussions, parties where everyone could share their story. Josh and Sarah became more active in their efforts, and their voices grew louder. However, despite all the successes, they still faced prejudice. At one event, several people with controversial views came to disrupt the meeting. They shouted about hatred and racism, trying to stir up conflict. It was a difficult test for Josh and Sarah, but they did not allow themselves to give in. They decided to stay put, hug each other, and show everyone that hatred will not win. "We're here to talk about love and unity," Josh said into the microphone, his voice full of determination. "We're not afraid of you. We're here to change the world for the better." These words brought about a storm of applause from the audience, and they felt that their communication and struggle had not been in vain. After this incident, Josh and Sarah continued their work. They began participating in protests that were happening in the city, engaging in dialogues about racism and bias. Their work did not go unnoticed, and they soon became known as local activists willing to fight for the rights of all people. As time passed, their initiative attracted the attention of local media. They became heroes in history, and their work to combat racism was covered in the news. This gave them strength and motivation to continue. Josh felt that they could really change the world, that they were part of something bigger. But fame also brought them to the attention of those who were against the changes. Josh and Sarah became targets of hate. One day, when they were driving home from an event, they found their car vandalized and a grim, hateful message left on the windshield. It was a tough test. They stood in front of their car, and Josh felt the anger rising inside him. "This is not normal," he said, clenching his fists. "We can't let them intimidate us. They're trying to break us," Sarah said, her voice shaking. "But we can't give up. We have to keep going." Josh turned to face her, his heart filling with determination. "We won't leave, Sarah. We will fight. We can't let hate win." Sarah nodded, and they went back to work. Despite the threats, they continued to organize events, discussions, and soon they noticed that their support was growing. People came, shared their stories, and supported their initiatives. It was encouraging. One night, at an event, Josh saw a familiar face in the audience. It was a woman who had once come to their first open mic night. She looked at him with admiration and hope. Josh approached her after the event. "How are you feeling?" he asked, looking into her eyes. "I love what you do," she replied, her voice full of emotion. "I feel stronger when I hear your stories." "We all have to support each other," Josh said. "That's what we're trying to create, a community where we can be heard." The woman nodded, and Josh felt his heart fill with joy. He knew that their efforts had not been in vain, that they were truly changing lives. But in the weeks that followed, they faced new challenges. Protests erupted in the city, and they were met with waves of hate. Some people tried to undermine their work by creating fake social media accounts and spreading false rumors about them. It was a difficult experience for Josh and Sarah, but they knew it only showed how important their work was. One day they decided to hold a rally, which was attended by people who supported their initiatives and those who opposed them. It was a very tense situation. The sky was covered with clouds, and against the backdrop of these confrontations, they decided to speak out. Josh walked onto the stage and looked at the people gathered around him. His heart was pounding in his chest, but he felt the power in his words. "We are here to fight for love, for unity, and for understanding," he said, his voice full of determination. "We are not against those who disagree with us. We are against hatred. We are against prejudice. We are against violence." Sarah walked up to him and they held hands, feeling each other's support. "We can't change the past," she continued, addressing the crowd, "but we can change the future. We can create a world where everyone is accepted for who they are." This drew thunderous applause from the supporters, but among the crowd of opponents, someone began to shout about hatred, about prejudice. Josh felt the anger rising inside him again, but he knew that now was not the time for aggression. "We're not here to argue," he said, trying to remain calm. "We're here to be heard. We're here to talk about love." Sarah added, "If anyone feels hatred, we invite you to talk to us. We want to hear why you feel that way. Let's try to understand each other." This caused some reaction among the crowd, and Josh saw some of the opponents begin to listen. It was the first step toward dialogue, toward understanding. But suddenly there was a scream and someone in the crowd threw a rock. It landed right in front of the stage, causing panic. People started running away and Josh grabbed Sarah's arm. "We have to go," he shouted, feeling the excitement spreading through the crowd. They made their way through the crowd, and Josh felt fear creeping into him. They ran out of the conflict zone, and finally found shelter in one of the nearby streets. "That was too close," Sarah said, her face pale. "Yes," Josh said, his heart pounding in his chest, "but we can't afford to give up. It only spurs us on." That night, they came to the conclusion that their fight was not over. They realized that real change takes time, patience, and teamwork. Despite all the trials and threats, they continued to work. Each new day they discovered something new, and each evening they returned to their actions, full of hope and determination. Josh and Sarah became not only partners in life, but also partners in struggle. They realized that their love and their work could change the world if they worked together. A few months passed, and their efforts began to bear fruit. They created a support program that helped people share their stories and provide assistance to those experiencing racism and bias. Josh and Sarah became heroes in their communities, and their initiative attracted media attention. One day, at an event, when they were discussing the success of their program, a woman approached them holding a little girl's hand. The woman was black and looked at them with admiration. "I want to say thank you," she said, her voice shaking with emotion. "Thanks to you, I know I'm not alone. I want my daughter to grow up in a world where she's loved for who she is." Josh and Sarah smiled, their hearts filled with joy. This was exactly what they had been fighting for. They realized that their efforts were truly changing lives, and this was just the beginning. Since then, their work has become not only a personal struggle, but also a collective initiative. They have organized conferences where they invite speakers to discuss racism, bias, and their impact on society. It has become a place where people can share their stories and find support. Over time, Josh and Sarah became icons of the fight against racism in their city. Their work continued to evolve, and they began collaborating with other organizations to expand their efforts. One day, while they were working on a new project, a group of students from a local university came to them. They wanted to participate in the program and offered to help organize events. Josh and Sarah were thrilled that young people were interested and willing to participate in change. "We want to help," said one of the students, his eyes shining with enthusiasm. "We know how important your work is, and we want to be a part of it." Josh and Sarah exchanged a look that filled them with hope. "We'd love to have your help," Sarah said. "Together we can achieve even greater success." As time passed, they began working together, creating new initiatives and projects. It wasn't just a collaboration, it became a true friendship. Josh and Sarah understood that their struggle was now part of a larger movement, and they weren't alone in that struggle. But despite all the successes, they still faced difficulties. Some people did not want to accept the changes, and this was a difficult test. One day, during one of the events, A conflict occurred. Several people with opposing views came to disrupt the meeting. Josh felt his heart throb. They had come with hate signs and started shouting, trying to distract from their message. But instead of giving in to fear, Josh and Sarah decided to stay and continue their performance. "We're here to talk about love and unity," Josh said, his voice full of determination. "We won't let hate win." It was a tough test, but they kept talking, and their sincerity and confidence in their words began to have an impact on the crowd. The people who had gathered for the event began to applaud and support them. Sarah added, "We all want peace and understanding. Together we can create a future where everyone is accepted." At that moment, something amazing happened. Some of those who had come with hatred began to listen. They began to see that Josh and Sarah were not enemies, but allies in the fight for a better future. This was a turning point, and the dialogue began to evolve. From there, their work continued to evolve, and they began to join forces with other groups working on change. They created a support network where people could share their stories and experiences. As time passed, Josh and Sarah became known in their city as leaders fighting for equality and justice. Their story inspired many, and they became a symbol of hope. However, one day, when they were returning home after a successful event, they were stopped by the police. It was unexpected and scary. Josh felt fear creeping up on him, but he knew he couldn't give up. The police began asking them questions, checking their documents. Josh and Sarah understood that this was part of a system that still existed. It was humiliating and unsettling. They knew that their work could lead to conflict, but they also understood that this was no reason to give up. "We're peaceful activists," Josh said, trying to remain calm. "We're not doing anything illegal." The police kept stopping them, and it was a difficult ordeal, but instead of giving in to fear, they decided to keep fighting. Josh and Sarah knew that their fight was important not only for them, but for everyone who had experienced injustice. "We're not leaving here until we're heard," Sarah said, her voice full of determination. This caused a huge reaction among the people who gathered around. People started supporting them, and it was amazing. They started sharing their stories of how they had experienced racism and bias. It was a powerful moment that showed that they were not alone in this fight. Eventually, the police realized their actions were pointless. They let Josh and Sarah go, but their experience only strengthened their resolve to continue the fight. They returned to their work, understanding that real change requires courage and determination. As their story continued to unfold, they knew their fight was far from over, but they were ready to continue. Together, they created a world where love and unity were the most important values. As time went on, their efforts began to make a real difference. They worked with local governments to implement new programs aimed at combating racism and bias. Their work inspired others, and they knew their fight was not in vain. One time, when they organized a big rally, they invited local politicians and community leaders. This was important to show that their efforts were getting attention and that change was really possible. When the rally began, Josh and Sarah stood on stage, full of pride in what they had done. "We're here to create a future where everyone's voice is heard," Josh said, looking out at the crowd. "We can change the world if we work together." Sarah continued, "We are all different, but we are all equal, and we must support each other in this fight." This brought a huge round of applause from the crowd. People felt like they were part of something bigger, and it was inspiring. Gradually, their work attracted more attention, and they began to receive support from local businesses and organizations. They created a foundation that helped fund programs aimed at educating and supporting people who faced racism. However, despite all the successes, they still faced difficulties. One day, when they were going to an important event, they learned that some opponents were planning to disrupt the meeting. This was a difficult test for Josh and Sarah, but they decided not to give up. "We can't let them intimidate us," Josh said, looking at Sarah. "We have to show that we're stronger." Sarah nodded, and they began to prepare for the event. They knew this was an important moment and they had to be ready. When the day of the event arrived, the crowd gathered around. Josh and Sarah stood on the stage, their hearts beating in unison. They felt the support of everyone who came, and it gave them strength. However, As they began to speak, cries of hatred began to rise from the crowd. It was a difficult ordeal, but Josh and Sarah knew they could not give up. They continued to speak, their voices growing louder. "We're here to talk about love and unity," Josh said. "We won't let hate win." Sarah added, "We all want peace and understanding. Together we can create a future where everyone is accepted." At that moment, something amazing happened. People in the crowd started supporting them, and the hatred began to go away. It was a powerful sign that their work really did matter. Time passed and their efforts began to bear fruit. They continued to work, and each new day was a step forward in their fight for equality and justice. They understood that their story was just beginning, and they were ready to continue. Despite all the trials and tribulations, Josh and Sarah remained hopeful. They knew their fight was not over, and they were ready to continue their work to create a world where love and unity would be the main values. And so the story of Josh and Sarah continued. They became symbols of the struggle for human rights, and their work inspired many. Each new day brought new opportunities and challenges, but they were ready for anything. It's been a few months since Josh and Sarah started their campaign against racism and bias. Their efforts to organize events and create a local support network have been a real source of inspiration for many. They have seen how their work changes lives, and this has given them strength. However, despite all the successes, tensions in the community continued to mount. One cold autumn evening, while Josh and Sarah were holding a community meeting, they received an unexpected call from a local reporter. "This is David from City News. I have information you need to know," he said, his voice growing anxious. "I just learned that there is a protest planned against you. It may not be just peaceful demonstrations." Josh and Sarah exchanged glances, realizing that their work had attracted the attention of not only supporters, but also those who wanted to stop them. "We have to prepare," Sarah said, her voice shaking with excitement. "If this becomes a real threat, we can't afford to give up." The next day, they held a meeting with allies and activists to discuss possible steps. The atmosphere was tense, but the determination of those present was clear. "We can't let hatred stop us," Josh began, his voice confident. "We have to show that we stand behind what we believe in, no matter the threats." "But what if they come with violence?" asked one of the participants, his face expressing alarm. "We must be prepared for any development." "We have the right to peaceful protest," Sarah replied, her eyes shining with determination. "Our strength lies in unity." Despite the danger, they decided to continue their work. That evening, they held a rally, which was attended by many supporters, but among them were also opponents, a group that was going to protest their actions. As Josh began speaking, he noticed familiar faces emerging from the crowd. They were people who had once supported them, but now they stood on the sidelines, hesitant to join the movement. "We are here to talk about love and understanding," he said, feeling the gaze of those who disliked him. "We are not against anyone. We are against hatred." Suddenly, there was a roar and the crowd of opponents began to close in around the rally. Their leaders shouted about hatred and prejudice, trying to intimidate their supporters. The atmosphere became tense and Josh felt fear creep into his heart. "We have to stay calm," he said into the microphone, his voice full of determination. "We can't let hate win." Sarah walked up to him and they both started talking about peace and unity. At one point, there was some shouting among the opponents and one of them threw a rock towards Josh. He dodged it and it caused panic among the supporters. "Get out!" someone from the crowd shouted. Suddenly there was a stampede and people began to run. Josh grabbed Sarah's hand and pulled her along, but the crowd was rapidly shrinking. When they finally got out of the conflict zone, they found shelter in one of the nearby cafes. They were shocked, but they felt that they could not stop. In the cafe, one of the activists approached them. "You have no idea what happened," he said, his voice shaking with emotion. "One of our men, whom you know, was among the enemy. He came with them." Josh and Sarah looked at each other, their hearts skipping a beat. It was Mark, an old friend who had once supported their endeavors. "Why did he do that?" Sarah asked, not believing her ears. "He was the victim of bias. His family believes that he betrayed them by joining you. Now he is trying to protect his interests," the activist replied. This revelation hit Josh and Sarah hard. They never thought they would face betrayal from those they trusted. The next day they decided to meet Mark to try to understand his motives. He looked depressed and scared when they met in a small park. "I didn't mean for this to happen," he began, his voice shaking. "My family threatened me. They couldn't understand why I supported you. I just wanted everything to be okay." "But why did you choose this side?" Sarah asked, her voice full of pain. "We all wanted the same thing." "I was desperate," Mark said, his eyes shining with tears. "I thought I could escape the hatred if I stayed with them. I was wrong." Josh felt his heart break with pity. He knew the situation was complicated, and that Mark might just be a victim of the system. "We can help you," he said, his voice full of confidence. "If you want, you can be part of our community again." "I don't know how you can forgive me," Mark replied, his face contorted with shame. "We're not here to judge you," Sarah said. "We're here to help. You're not alone." Despite all efforts, the situation continued to deteriorate. Opponents began organizing rallies, and Mark found himself in the middle of this conflict. His family did not want to accept the fact that he chose the side of the enemies. They began to threaten him, and Mark found himself between a rock and a hard place. One evening, while Josh and Sarah were holding a meeting, they received a text from Mark. He wrote that he felt unsafe and didn't know what to do. "We have to help him," Sarah said, her voice shaking with worry. "He's in trouble." Josh agreed, and they immediately set off to see Mark. Their hearts pounded with excitement as they drove. When they arrived at his house, they saw his parents standing outside, waiting for him to return. "You betrayed us," his father shouted as Mark walked out. "You are no longer our son." The scene was full of drama and pain. Mark stood there in complete confusion, and Josh felt his heart squeeze with fear for his friend. "I came to help," Josh said, stepping forward. "We've all been through tough times, and we need to be together." But Mark's parents didn't listen. They started screaming, accusing him of betrayal. Finally, at some point, the situation got out of control, and one of the relatives hit Mark, and he, confused, fell to the ground. This was the turning point. Seeing Mark being beaten, Josh and Sarah couldn't stand by. They rushed to his side, protecting him from the attacks. "Get out," Josh yelled, raising his hands to stop the aggression. "We're here to help." Sarah rushed to Mark's defense, and at that moment something unexpected happened. A woman appeared in the crowd and introduced herself as a local lawyer. "Enough," she screamed, her voice full of authority. "You can't treat him like this. This is violence and prejudice." The situation became more tense, but the lawyer's intervention made everyone understand that their actions had consequences. She told Mark that he had the right to protection and support. Finally, Mark stood up, his eyes full of tears. He looked at Josh and Sarah and said, "I can't stay in the shadows anymore. I want to be with you." This moment became decisive for their entire group. They realized that despite all the difficulties, prejudices, and hatred, they must continue to fight for equality and justice. Together, they began organizing new events to bring their ideas to more people. As time passed, their work began to bear fruit. They began to team up with other change-making groups, and together they organized large rallies and events that brought attention to their cause. Their efforts attracted the attention of local authorities and the media. Gradually, a change in public consciousness began. People began to speak openly about racism, bias, and the need for change. One day, when they were hosting a big event downtown, a woman approached them and told them how their work had inspired her. She shared her story of how her family had faced prejudice, and how Josh and Sarah had become a symbol of hope for her children. This inspiration became a powerful impetus for Josh, Sarah, and Mark. They realized that their story of struggle and overcoming could become an example for others. Eventually, they decided to organize a large festival dedicated to unity and diversity to raise awareness of racism and bias. They worked on every aspect of the event, and this became their overall goal. When the day of the festival arrived, it was a huge success. Thousands of people came to support the ideas of equality and love. The music was playing and there were smiles on people's faces. Josh, Sarah, and Mark stood on the stage, looking out at the hopeful crowd. They knew their fight was far from over, but they also knew they weren't alone. They had created something meaningful that inspired others, and they were ready to keep going. With each new step they took, they came closer to their ideal, a world where everyone would be accepted, regardless of skin color, origin, or religion. It was their story, their struggle, and they knew they would be the catalysts for the change their society so desperately needed. The festival was the beginning of a new movement. Each year, Josh, Sarah, and Mark continued to gather people, forming a community that not only fought against bias, but also created a platform for dialogue and understanding. They realized that change takes time and effort, but every step forward was important. One day, as they sat in a cafe after a successful event, Sarah looked at her friends and said, "Do you realize that we can really change the world? Out there, outside our city, people are starting to talk about equality, about how important it is." Josh nodded. "Yes, and this is just the beginning, but we need to continue working, opening new horizons and attracting more people to our cause." Mark, inspired, added, "I feel like our story is not just about us. It's about everyone who has ever faced bias or discrimination. We have to continue to inspire them to fight for their rights, too." But despite their successes, their trials did not leave them. The hatred they had faced in the beginning did not disappear. Sometimes their activism provoked aggression from radical groups. Once, after a peaceful event, they received an anonymous warning about possible attacks on activists. "We have to be careful," Josh said as they discussed the threats, "but we can't let fear stop us." Sarah agreed, adding, "We must keep talking. Every time we remain silent, hatred wins." They decided to organize additional security at their events and involve the local police to ensure the safety of all participants. This decision allowed them to continue their work without losing their goal. During this time, Mark was facing personal difficulties. His relationship with his family continued to deteriorate, and he felt trapped. Despite his determination, he began to doubt his choices. One day he met with Josh and Sarah to discuss his feelings. "I don't know what to do next. My family still rejects me, and it's really hard," he admitted, his voice full of pain. Sarah came closer and said, "You are not alone. We are all here for you, and we will fight for you until you can do it yourself. Your family does not determine your worth." Josh added, "Yes, you have become an important part of our movement. You are bringing change, and it is your story that helps others." These words encouraged Mark, and he felt that he could continue to fight not only for himself, but also for those who had not yet found their voice. Soon, Josh, Sarah, and Mark decided to take their work a step further. They began holding educational seminars and workshops in schools to discuss issues of racism and bias with young people. They wanted the younger generation to understand the importance of respect and acceptance. During one of these seminars, a young girl stood up and said, "I have always been afraid to speak up about how I feel. I know that bias exists, and it is very scary, but I want to be part of the solution." These words touched Josh and Sarah's hearts. They realized that their efforts were beginning to bear fruit. Young people were ready to talk openly about issues and participate in the fight for equality. Sometime later, Josh received a message from the local government. They were impressed by the work he and his friends had done in recent years and offered to collaborate on a new project to improve social inclusion and combat racism in their region. It was a surprising recognition. Josh and his friends accepted the offer and began developing joint initiatives that attracted even more people to their cause. However, soon after, they faced a serious threat. A radical group that could not accept their success began organizing protests against them. They created fake news to discredit the activists and incited people to violence. "We have to be careful," Josh said as they discussed the situation, "but we can't stay silent. We have to keep doing our job." At this point, a woman approached them and introduced herself as a reporter. She offered them the opportunity to tell their story in a local newspaper so that people would know the truth and see what was behind their movement. The story in the newspaper resonated. People started going out to the streets, supporting the activists. The rallies and events that Josh, Sarah, and Mark held became even more attended. They attracted media attention and began to attract interest from a wider audience. This gave them a chance to make a difference. Their youth outreach initiative began to receive support from educational institutions, as well as local businesses, which began to provide resources and funding for their projects. After years of hard work and struggle, Josh, Sarah, and Mark became symbols of hope for many. They were invited to an international conference where they could share their experiences and developments with activists from all over the world. At the conference, Josh gave a speech about the importance of unity, understanding, and love. We all came here to talk about change, but I want to emphasize that change starts with us. We must continue to work together, support each other, and, most importantly, never lose hope. These words resonated with the participants, and many of them were inspired to create their own initiatives. When they returned home, they realized that their work had only just begun, but now they knew that together they could overcome any difficulties. Each new day was a step forward, and they were ready to continue their fight. With every success and every challenge, they only grew stronger. Josh, Sarah, and Mark knew there was still much work to do in the world, but they believed that by working together, they could create a society based on love, respect, and equality. The story of Josh, Sarah, and Mark became emblematic not only of their struggle, but of millions of people around the world. Their experience showed that even in the darkest times, there is light and hope. They continued their work, inspiring others and breaking new ground for justice. And when they looked at what they had already accomplished, they knew it was only the beginning. Every day was an opportunity to create a better future, and they were ready to take on the challenge. There was hope in their hearts, and they knew that together they could overcome any obstacles on the path to unity and love. If you enjoyed this story, we would love to hear your thoughts. Please comment below what you think about the fight against racism and if you have experienced any bias in your life. Each of you is very important to us, and we truly value your opinion and support. If you liked our video, don't forget to like and subscribe to the channel so you don't miss new stories and discussions. Have a wonderful day.